Imagine waking up in a town that no longer exists on any map, a town swallowed by time, erased from memory, and feared by those who still whisper its name. In the misty valleys of Colorado, there was once a family whose curse defied nature itself. Their secret was not written in blood, but grown from it, in the form of teeth that never stopped returning. This is not a legend passed down for thrill. It's a documented mystery buried under the earth of Greymont, a place where the dead did not stay buried, and neither did their teeth. The Greymont family's disturbing physical anomaly was not just the talk of a superstitious mining town, it was something that defied the very fabric of human biology. It began subtly, with whispers about their perfect smiles, their unnaturally white teeth, and their tendency to never visit the town's only dentist, even when sickness spread through every home. Jonathan Greymont, the patriarch, had come from Europe with his wife Helena and their 3 children, bringing wealth and refinement to a settlement made of miners and laborers. They built a sprawling mansion on the hill overlooking Greymont Valley, a house with high windows, thick curtains, and a strange smell that no one could place. Something metallic, something like rust and roses. It wasn't until one miner, drunk in the saloon one night, claimed he'd seen Jonathan in the moonlight pulling out his own teeth with his bare hands that people started paying attention. The next morning, when that same miner turned up missing, no one dared to question what he had seen. As the months went by, odd details began to surface. A servant girl who worked in the Greymont house told her sister that every night before bed, each family member would stand in front of a mirror and pluck out their teeth one by one, calmly placing them in a silver bowl filled with some dark liquid. She said they did it without pain, as though it were part of their nightly routine. When the sister told this story to the local preacher, Father O'Doul, he called it blasphemy. But when he confronted Helena Greymont after church, she only smiled, revealing teeth that were sharper than he remembered, and eyes that glinted too much in the candlelight. He later wrote in his journal that he felt an unexplainable dread in her presence, as if the air around her carried something old and unnatural. Local Dr. Elias Crow, a young man with scientific curiosity, decided to investigate after several townsfolk came to him with stories of the Greymonts bleeding from the mouth, but showing no sign of illness. One winter evening, he visited the Greymont estate under the guise of delivering medicine. What he found disturbed him to his core. He described in his private notes that the youngest daughter, Clara, had lost all her teeth by nightfall, yet by morning, new ones had already sprouted, stronger, sharper, and more numerous than before. Her gums were lined with small pearl-like growths, forming in clusters, almost animalistic in nature. Crow, terrified but fascinated, begged Jonathan to allow him to study the phenomenon. Jonathan refused, saying only that their family's blood heals what the earth takes. Crow left the estate shaken, certain that what he had witnessed was something far beyond medicine or nature. Rumors spread quickly through the small mining town. Some believed the family's condition was the result of inbreeding or a rare disease. Others whispered that it was punishment for something unspeakable. But those who had lived long enough in the valley knew better. They remembered the night years earlier when lightning struck the hill during the mansion's construction and how the ground had seemed to tremble as if alive. They remembered Helena Greymont's arrival from Europe, her pale skin untouched by sun, her strange herbs and oils, and the way she always avoided the church. People began to link her to witchcraft, to curses carried from the old world, and to stories of blood rites that gave eternal youth at a terrible price. By spring of 1872, the Greymonts' condition had worsened, or evolved. They no longer hid their nightly ritual. Servants spoke of hearing bone cracking, of the sound of teeth falling into silver bowls, and of Helena chanting in a language no one recognized. Each morning, their smiles looked different, as though the teeth that had regrown were not human at all. They gleamed like polished ivory, longer and curved at the edges, and when they laughed, it made even the bravest men in town uneasy. Children were warned to stay away from the estate, yet some disobeyed, drawn by curiosity and fear. A few never returned. Dr. Crow tried once more to intervene, bringing a sheriff and a preacher with him to confront the family. They entered the mansion after midnight, and what they found inside was a nightmare of perfection. The Greymonts were seated around a long table, lit by dozens of candles, their mouths dripping blood as they calmly removed their teeth, each one falling neatly into a bowl already filled with others. The preacher fainted at the sight, while Crow stood frozen as Helena looked up, smiling, and said that this was renewal. The sheriff fired his gun in panic, but the bullets did not stop Jonathan, who stood and walked toward them, his mouth a gory ruin, yet still smiling, as if the act of losing his teeth gave him strength instead of pain. When they fled into the night, they swore they heard laughter echoing through the walls, followed by the distinct clicking sound of teeth falling onto wood. The next day, the mansion's windows were shuttered, and the family was nowhere to be seen. The sheriff wanted to burn the place down, but the townsfolk hesitated, terrified that whatever lived inside might not die with fire. Meanwhile, the doctor's notes vanished from his office, though he later told one confidant that he had seen something in the Greymont cellar, hundreds of small teeth embedded into the walls as if they had grown there like vines. As time passed, those who remained in Greymont learned to live with the unease. They avoided the hill, sealed their doors at night, and spoke of the Greymonts only in whispers. Yet every so often someone would find small white fragments scattered near the stream, teeth so clean they looked new as if freshly shed. And though the family was rarely seen in town anymore, their presence lingered, especially in the nights when the wind howled through the valley and carried what sounded like faint, rhythmic laughter, mixed with the clicking of teeth growing back again and again as if the curse itself would never let them rest. The isolated mining town of Greymont, Colorado, was the kind of place that didn't appear on most maps, and those who found it rarely stayed for long. Surrounded by jagged cliffs and pine forests that never seemed to end, the town existed in a strange pocket of silence where echoes carried too far and shadows stretched too long. When the Greymont family first settled there, the townsfolk welcomed them with awe and curiosity. They brought with them refinement, wealth, and a promise of progress that the rough miners had never known. But as time passed, that admiration turned into unease, and unease into quiet dread. It wasn't just the family's peculiar habits that unnerved people. It was the feeling that something unnatural had taken root in the valley the moment they arrived. The family's mansion stood on the highest point overlooking the town, a towering structure of grey stone that seemed to grow out of the mountain itself. During the day, smoke rose steadily from its chimneys, and faint sounds of music or laughter would drift down to the streets below. But at night, all the windows glowed faintly, even when no fire burned within, as though the walls themselves were alive with light. The townsfolk spoke of seeing movement behind the curtains long after the candles should have gone out, strange silhouettes pacing back and forth, sometimes multiple shapes merging into one before vanishing entirely. No one could explain it, but everyone felt its presence. At first, the Greymonts participated in the life of the town, attending Sunday service and hosting gatherings that displayed their wealth. Helena Greymont, elegant and pale, would stand in the church pews beside her husband Jonathan, her expression distant but polite. Their children, Clara, Thomas, and young Edward, rarely spoke, though their stares made people uncomfortable. It was as if they were studying everyone, memorizing faces and smiles. Then, as the months went by, they stopped coming altogether. Father O'Doul would later write that their absence coincided with an increase in what he called spiritual unrest, livestock dying overnight, miners vanishing in the woods, and the faint sound of wailing heard from the mountains during storms. There was one night in the winter of 1872 when the silence of Greymont was broken by a sound so eerie that no one who heard it ever forgot. It began as a low hum, almost like wind through a pipe, and grew louder until it became a chorus of shrill cries echoing from the Greymont estate. Several men gathered their courage and went up the hill to investigate, carrying lanterns and rifles. They found the great iron gates open, the snow untouched, except for one long trail leading toward the cellar doors. When they pushed those doors open, a rush of warm air smelling of iron and decay escaped, followed by the unmistakable sound of chewing. They didn't stay long enough to see what it was. By the next morning, the gates were closed again, and the snow was smooth as if no one had ever walked there. After that night, the people of Greymont began to change. Fear had settled into the town's bones. Men refused to work after sundown, and women locked their children indoors before dark. A miner named Abram Tiller, who lived closest to the hill, swore he saw the Greymont children wandering the forest barefoot in the snow, their mouths glistening red and their breath fogging in slow, unnatural patterns. When he told others, They dismissed him as drunk, but when his cabin was found empty days later, with only a pile of clean teeth on his bed, the laughter stopped. Strange disappearances became common. Horses were found drained of blood, dogs vanished, and on some mornings, small puddles of red ice appeared on the edge of the creek. The town's doctor refused to speak of it openly, though he carried a haunted look from then on. He claimed once to have seen Jonathan Greymont at dawn, standing barefoot in the snow, smiling as fresh blood dripped from his lips. When he called out to him, Jonathan turned and said something the doctor couldn't hear before vanishing behind the fog. Rumors spread quickly in a place as small as Greymont. Some said the family had made a pact with something buried deep in the mountain, that their wealth and longevity came from an agreement sealed with blood. Others said the mine beneath the estate connected to something ancient, a place where no man should ever dig. What unsettled people most was that every few weeks the family's carriage would roll through town before sunset, and the driver, an old, pale man with no visible eyes, would hand out small packages of meat to the miners' families. No one knew what kind of meat it was, but those who ate it claimed they slept deeply afterward, dreaming of faces they didn't recognize and whispers that came from beneath their beds. By the time spring arrived, the town was half abandoned. The schoolhouse closed, and the church bells stopped ringing. Father O'Doul had gone missing, last seen walking up toward the mansion with his Bible clutched to his chest. Only one man claimed to see what happened that night. He said the church steeple glowed red for a moment before going dark, and that something with too many teeth was crawling across the roof of the Greymont house under the moonlight. Those who remained lived in silence, haunted by sounds that drifted down from the hill, soft footsteps, faint singing, and sometimes the echo of laughter that didn't sound quite human. They said the Greymonts no longer needed to hide what they were, that the town itself belonged to them now. And in the last days before the valley was finally abandoned, travelers passing through reported seeing a single light flickering in the mansion's upper window, moving from room to room, as though someone or something was pacing, waiting for new visitors to arrive. Even years later, when the mine collapsed and the town's remains were buried under snow and rock, those who passed through the valley spoke of a strange stillness that hung in the air. No birds sang, no animals lingered, and if one listened closely enough, they could swear they heard the faint grinding sound of teeth beneath the ground, like something restless waiting to rise again from beneath the ruins of Greymont. Mysterious medical reports and church records about the Greymont family began surfacing years after the town had already started to decay, and those documents became the only trace of the unnatural events that plagued the valley. The earliest report was written by Dr. Elias Crow, a young physician who had moved to Greymont in 1870, full of ambition and rational belief in science. He recorded that the family suffered from what he initially thought was an extreme form of regenerative gum disease, but the more he observed, the more he realized it was something that could not be categorized within human medicine. He described how the Greymont's teeth would fall out during the night, sometimes all at once, yet by the following morning, new ones would emerge from the raw flesh as if sculpted overnight. These were not ordinary teeth, but stronger, sharper, and more numerous than human dentition should allow. Crow wrote that the structure of their jaws seemed to expand slightly each time, making room for the next regrowth, as though their bodies were adapting to something older and more primal. He noted that the process caused no pain to the family, only a strange satisfaction. Helena Greymont would smile through the blood, her lips parted to reveal rows of perfect ivory teeth just beginning to surface from beneath her gums. When Crow questioned her about it, she spoke calmly, saying that their ancestors had been chosen by the Mother of Renewal, a being of ancient origin who promised everlasting vitality. Her husband Jonathan dismissed the doctor's unease, explaining that the regeneration was a sign of health, not corruption. Yet Crow observed other symptoms: skin that never bruised, wounds that sealed within minutes, and a peculiar aversion to sunlight. Their bodies, he realized, were not simply regenerating, they were transforming. The doctor's fascination soon turned into fear. His notes detailed how he collected one of the fallen teeth from the Greymont home when no one was watching. Under his magnifying lens, the tooth appeared to pulse faintly, as if alive. It bled when cut, and when left in a sealed jar overnight, it seemed to grow faint filaments from its root, seeking something to latch onto. Crow wrote that he buried it behind his cabin out of fear, but could not sleep afterward, plagued by dreams of teeth sprouting through his skin. He confessed to Father O'Doul soon after, hoping for guidance, But the priest's response only deepened his dread. Father O'Doul had been keeping his own record, a secret ledger written in the margins of the church's baptism registry. His entries described encounters that defied his faith. He wrote that during confession, Helena Greymont admitted to performing nightly rituals of renewal in which the family drank a mixture of their own blood and animal marrow. She claimed it was part of a covenant older than Christianity, passed through her bloodline since before the family came to America. The priest, horrified, tried to intervene by performing a private exorcism at their estate. But he returned to the church pale and trembling, saying only that he had seen something with eyes like burning coals watching him from within the walls. In later pages, he wrote that the Greymonts were not possessed, but bound, and that their condition was not demonic possession, but something much worse, a gift from something ancient, a force that existed before sin itself. More reports emerged from those who had brief encounters with the family. A traveling dentist who visited the town in 1871 left behind a letter describing a visit to the mansion. He wrote that when he offered to inspect their teeth, Helena refused, but her son Thomas opened his mouth willingly. The dentist described a jaw that was not quite human, lined with rows of emerging teeth that shimmered faintly in the candlelight, each one shaped slightly differently, almost like scales. He left the town the same night, abandoning his wagon and tools. When his belongings were later recovered, his journal contained a single unfinished line. "They do not chew, they feed." Church records from neighboring towns mentioned that a group of parishioners traveling through the valley in the spring of 1872 found mutilated livestock arranged in circles, their skulls split open as if by small but powerful jaws. They took it as a sign of witchcraft and warned the local clergy. In response, Father O'Doul compiled a final letter addressed to the bishop in Denver. In it, he described the family's rituals, their nocturnal activities, and the strange glow that emanated from their home each night. He wrote that he believed the family's teeth were vessels of an ancient curse tied to blood and rebirth. The letter ended abruptly, the last line smeared with ink and something that looked suspiciously like blood. When historians later uncovered these fragmented accounts, they found more chilling details in the town's remaining medical logs. Dr. Crow had continued to study the phenomenon in secret. His final report, dated weeks before his disappearance, claimed that he had discovered traces of human bone marrow inside the Greymont's saliva samples, suggesting that their bodies were feeding on themselves, constantly rebuilding and consuming in a cycle of self-renewal. He wrote that the regeneration was accelerating, that the family's teeth were multiplying faster than human tissue could sustain, and that their skulls might eventually be overtaken by bone growth. The last page of his report was scrawled with a frantic note: "It is spreading. Their curse is not bound to blood alone, but to breath. They exhale it." After the disappearance of both the doctor and the priest, the church sealed the town's records, marking them as heretical. For decades, the documents remained buried in diocesan archives until a historian uncovered them in the early 1900s. By then, the town of Greymont was nothing but ruins, yet the reports carried the same eerie detail. Wherever the Greymonts had gone, unnatural regeneration followed. In one recovered church journal, a later priest described opening the old coffin of a supposed Greymont descendant in Denver and finding a skull with brand new teeth growing through its bone. Another account from a mortuary worker told of corpses whose mouths bled hours after death, their gums swelling as though preparing for one final regrowth. The connection between the medical reports and the church records became undeniable. Science had documented the impossible, while faith had named it unholy. Together they painted a picture of a family that had crossed a boundary nature was never meant to allow. Their nightly transformation was not illness, but invocation, a ritual that had fused flesh and spirit into something immortal yet monstrous. Every tooth that fell was a sacrifice, every regrowth a reminder of the ancient power pulsing beneath their cursed lineage. And as those old documents spread through hands unprepared for their truth, the whispers began again, not only in Greymont's ruins, but in nearby towns, where locals claimed to see pale faces smiling from the tree line and small white fragments scattered across the soil, as if something once buried was slowly beginning to grow back. The townsfolk's attempt to destroy the Greymont lineage began on a night when fear finally outweighed reason. For months they had watched the family grow more reclusive, more unnatural, and more inhuman. The mansion on the hill had become a place of dread, where no birds flew overhead and no sound but the faint crack of bones and whispers could be heard through the night wind. It started with the disappearance of Father O'Doul, whose last known act was walking up the hill carrying a crucifix and a lantern. The next morning, the lantern was found on the steps of the church, the glass stained with blood, the crucifix snapped in half. That was when the people of Greymont decided they could no longer live under the shadow of that house. The plan formed in silence, passed between trembling lips and secret gatherings inside the saloon after dark. Men who once mined together now spoke of holy fire and justice, their hands shaking as they gripped bottles of whiskey and makeshift torches. Women wept quietly, knowing that their husbands might not return, but no one dared to argue. The children had begun waking at night, screaming about faces in their windows and voices calling their names from the hill. One child, the blacksmith's son, was found one morning near the river, alive but too frightened to speak, his tongue swollen and his mouth bleeding as though he had tried to tear something out of his own gums. That was the final spark. When the moon rose full and pale over the valley, 20 men gathered at the edge of town. They carried oil, shovels and rifles, their breath fogging in the cold air. The snow was heavy that night, yet the sky was clear, and the Greymont house loomed above them like a tomb carved into the mountain. No lights glowed in its windows, but faint movement flickered behind the curtains, as if someone, or something, was waiting for them to come. They crossed the field in silence, their boots crunching against the frozen earth. As they neared the mansion, the smell hit them first, a mix of copper and rot, thick enough to make their stomachs turn. The iron gate creaked open on its own, the hinges moaning in a tone that sounded almost like laughter. Inside the courtyard, they found the remains of animals scattered across the ground, bones stripped clean, skulls cracked and teeth littered like gravel. Some of the men hesitated, but Jonathan Greymont's voice echoed faintly from the house, calling out as if he already knew they were there. He welcomed them by name. One man swore later that Jonathan's voice came from everywhere at once, like it was being whispered through the walls and trees. They moved forward, torches raised high, determined to end whatever curse had taken hold of the town. When they burst through the mansion's doors, they were met with a suffocating heat and the smell of blood. The grand hall was lined with portraits, each one depicting the family with perfect smiles and shining eyes, though some of the faces seemed to shift in the flickering firelight, teeth appearing where none had been painted before. In the center of the room stood the family themselves, Jonathan, Helena, and their 3 children, all dressed in white, standing perfectly still as if awaiting judgment. The youngest, Clara, held a silver bowl filled with blood and teeth, which she tilted toward the men as though offering it to them. The sheriff, trembling but resolute, shouted for them to surrender, to face God's punishment. Jonathan only smiled, his mouth glistening red, and said that God had already turned his face away from this place. Then, before anyone could move, the sound began, the sickening snap of bone and the soft patter of teeth falling onto the marble floor. Helena opened her mouth, and rows of new teeth pushed through the old blood spilling down her chin as she whispered something in a language none of them understood. The men screamed, firing their rifles wildly, the sound echoing through the hall. The bullets hit flesh, but did nothing. The Greymonts didn't bleed like normal people. Instead, their wounds closed as fast as they opened, sealing over with pale, waxy skin. Panic took hold. The men threw their torches, setting the drapes and furniture aflame. The room filled with smoke and the stench of burning oil, yet through it all the family only watched, smiling as their teeth gleamed brighter in the firelight. One miner, clutching a cross to his chest, claimed he saw dozens of shadowy figures emerging from the walls, faces without eyes, mouths filled with teeth, crawling toward them like a tide. He ran before the flames consumed the hall, stumbling into the snow with his hands covered in blood that wasn't his own. The mansion burned for hours, the flames visible from every corner of the valley. Some said they heard screams that sounded less like agony and more like laughter. When dawn came, the townsfolk climbed the hill to see what was left. The house was a blackened skeleton of stone and ash, the ground still smouldering. No bodies were found, only fragments of teeth scattered through the rubble, hundreds of them glistening like tiny pearls. Some were human, others far too large or twisted to belong to any known creature. The people gathered them up and buried them in the churchyard, believing that the fire had cleansed the evil from their town. But that night, the earth around the graves began to shift. The next morning, the mound of dirt was cracked open from beneath, the bones and teeth gone. Those who dared to return to the site of the mansion claimed the ashes were disturbed, as if something had moved under them during the night. A faint humming sound filled the air, like the echo of many mouths whispering together. The miners who stayed long enough to hear it said they felt something vibrating in their jaws, a pressure beneath their teeth that made them sick to their stomachs. The town's attempts to rebuild failed. Tools broke without reason, crops refused to grow, and a thick mist began to hang permanently over the valley. One by one, families packed up and left, abandoning their homes to the snow. By the end of that year, Greymont was nothing but an empty shell, a ghost of what it once was. The only sign that life had ever existed there were the faint impressions of footprints frozen into the ground around the ruins of the mansion, barefoot prints, small and large, circling the ashes as though dancing in the moonlight. Those who looked too long said they could still hear the faint sound of teeth clattering softly beneath the earth, as if the family the town tried to destroy had simply gone deeper, waiting for their chance to rise again. The chilling aftermath of the Greymont fire haunted Colorado for generations, but what was found years later beneath the ruins turned fear into obsession. When the snow finally melted from the hills, the few remaining settlers who dared to approach the charred estate were met with an eerie sight. The land where the Greymont mansion once stood was blackened and lifeless, but the soil beneath was unnaturally soft, as though something had been moving beneath it. The smell of iron still hung in the air, faint but unmistakable. When the first graves were unearthed, what they found defied everything the living understood about death. Inside the burned remains of what appeared to be the Greymont family tombs were skulls that should have been long decayed, but they weren't. They were pristine, untouched by time, their jaws frozen in wide, unnatural smiles, and inside those jaws were rows of perfectly white teeth, freshly grown, as if death had never been able to stop their regeneration. The discovery sent shockwaves through the nearby towns. Men from Denver and Boulder arrived to examine the remains, but most left after a single night, refusing to speak about what they had seen. A few stayed long enough to record their findings. They noted that the skulls were warm to the touch, even after being exposed to the open air for days. One scientist, an anthropologist named Dr. Arthur Winslow, wrote that he had never seen anything like it in his career. He described the teeth as having no roots, almost as though they had grown directly from the bone itself. In one of his notes, he mentioned hearing faint cracking sounds while examining the skulls, as if new teeth were forming even then. He left Greymont abruptly after that, abandoning his equipment, and was later found dead on a train heading east, his jaw shattered and his tongue bitten in half. Local superstition grew wild after that. People said the ground itself was cursed, that the fire hadn't destroyed the Greymonts but merely forced them deeper into the earth. Some miners who reopened the nearby shaft reported strange vibrations echoing from below, like hundreds of small tapping noises on the stone. They thought it was the sound of dripping water, until one man found a fragment of a human tooth embedded in the rock wall, as if it had grown there. The miners sealed the shaft within days and refused to return, leaving their tools behind. They said that on some nights the tunnels still hummed, like the sound of teeth grinding together far below the surface. In the early 1900s, to document the forgotten town, they were warned by locals not to stay overnight. They ignored the warnings. That evening, they set up camp near what they believed was the remains of the churchyard, where the townsfolk had buried the teeth they gathered after the fire. In the middle of the night, one of them woke to the sound of whispering. He thought it was the wind at first, but when he looked outside, he saw small impressions forming in the snow, tiny circular holes, as if something beneath the ground was pressing upward. By dawn, their campsite was gone. Their notebooks were later found half buried near the old mine entrance, the pages smeared with mud and blood. The last legible sentence read, "They are still smiling." Decades later, the government sent surveyors to the area with the intention of building a dam nearby. They unearthed what they believed were remnants of old graves. Inside those graves, the bones were arranged unnaturally, stacked together like roots winding through soil. Every skull bore the same mark, rows of freshly formed teeth, some even growing through the eye sockets. The workers refused to continue the excavation, claiming that the bones made noise at night, clicking faintly when the air turned cold. One worker swore he saw something crawling through the dirt, something pale and human-shaped that disappeared as soon as he pointed his lantern at it. The project was abandoned, and the government records labeled the site unstable. What happened to those bones afterward remains a mystery. Some were supposedly transported to Denver for further study, but the train carrying them derailed outside of the city. Witnesses who helped with the wreck reported finding strange debris scattered along the tracks, hundreds of teeth shining under the moonlight, scattered like seeds. The crates that had held the remains were torn open from the inside. For years after, train engineers refused to take that route at night, claiming they could hear faint laughter echoing through the mountains whenever they passed through the valley. Even now, the name Greymont carries a certain dread among locals who still live near the old mountain pass. They say the curse never died with the family. On cold nights, when the snow is heavy and the wind howls through the trees, travelers have reported hearing rhythmic tapping beneath their feet, like fingernails scratching at the frozen ground. Sometimes, after storms, small white fragments appear scattered across the hillside. Those who pick them up say they're smooth and warm, and when left alone overnight, they multiply. In the years that followed, the legend of the Greymonts spread beyond Colorado, retold in whispers by travelers and miners who claimed to have seen the valley for themselves. Some said the curse infected anyone who disturbed their resting place, that people who took even a single fragment home began to suffer strange symptoms. Their gums would ache, their teeth would loosen. Then, one by one, they would fall out, only to regrow by morning, sharper and whiter than before. Doctors called it delusion. Priests called it judgment. But the families who suffered it disappeared quietly, leaving behind homes where mirrors were covered and the floors littered with small, clean teeth. To this day, those who pass through the Greymont Valley say the earth there feels alive, soft underfoot, like something breathing just below the surface. And when the wind is still, the silence carries an almost imperceptible sound, the faint clicking of enamel against enamel, steady and endless, like the valley itself is chewing through time, waiting for the day when the Greymonts finally rise again from beneath the soil where their teeth still grow.